Richard's reliance on Buckingham, in fact, backfired very quickly after he had taken the throne. By the autumn of 1483, Buckingham himself was plotting against the new king. He was probably involved with Bishop Morton, the Bishop of Ely, who himself was involved in plots with Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother, and surviving members of the Woodville family. In October 1483, Buckingham actually rose in rebellion against Richard III. It's a level of just how unpopular Buckingham was that his rebellion really didn't gather any support at all. It was only when Henry Tudor decided to join the rebellion that other members of the political nation actually took arms against Richard. These were members of Edward IV's old household and members of the affinity of the Woodville family. They were not supporters of Buckingham. The failure of Richard to command the loyalty of former members of the Yorkist establishment, I think, is the most fundamental failing of his kingship. Men like Giles Daubney, who had been in Edward IV's household and had served the House of York perhaps for 15 or 20 years, in the autumn of 1483 joined Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor's claim to the English throne, as we know, was very weak, and really in the 1470s he had been marginalised and was an outsider in English politics. The fact that former members of the Yorkist household could look to Henry Tudor rather than to Richard III, I think is a very clear statement of the failure of Richard's kingship. By 1484, these networks of conspiracy, which involved members of the former Yorkist establishment had spread far and wide. In East Anglia, men like Sir John Fortescue were plotting with Morton and with Margaret Beaufort, taking former members of the Howard affinity, as we've seen, like William Brandon, and former members of Edward IV's household into this network of conspiracy against Richard. In Kent, men like Sir Richard Guildford, who had links with the Woodvilles, also began to look to Henry Tudor as a possible replacement for Richard III. Perhaps the best example of this is in Calais. Calais was a key to the English throne at this time, partly because of its commercial strength. It was the centre for English exports to the continent, but also because of its military strength. It was a home to a garrison of perhaps 800 men, which was the only permanent military force that the English king could count on. In 1484, John Blount, who was the captain of Ham's Castle, one of the outlying garrisons in Calais, and jailer of the Lancastrian Earl of Oxford, who had been languishing there through much of the 1470s after his rebellion against Edward IV, actually escaped to join Tudor. Blount let Oxford out of prison, and the two of them crossed the Calais Pale into France and actually joined Tudor's party. This, I think, is a really serious this was a really serious problem for Richard, and Richard was powerless to stop this because the Lieutenant of Calais, John Dinham, basically let it happen. He was again another member of Edward's household, and Richard was in fact forced to appoint his illegitimate son, John, as captain of Calais over Dinham. In doing this, of course, he underlined his mistrust of Dinham, and in 1485, at the key moment when Tudor invaded, and at the Battle of Bosworth, the Calais garrison, this huge resource, this military resource which Richard should have counted on, actually remained in Calais and took no part in the campaign of 1485. The reasons for the lack of this support, I think, are simple. The political nation was at first uneasy, and then on reflection horrified by Richard's actions in 1483. There were certain key attributes that each and every medieval king needed. These were prudence, piety and prowess. Richard certainly had piety and prowess, but prudence he was clearly lacking in. One of the key words, I think, for late medieval people was this idea of covetousness. Kings should act for the public good. They should act for what contemporaries referred to as the common weal. In his actions in 1483, Richard could clearly be shown to be acting out of self-interest. Edward V, when he came to the throne in 1483, was 12 years old. This was the time when the responsibilities of kingships could begin to be transferred to him. Richard clearly feared that under Edward V, his position, perhaps his position in the north, perhaps his lands, were under threat. So he acted in self-interest rather than in the interests of the community of the realm in deposing Edward V. Richard's hatred and rivalry of the Woodville family was also out of self-interest. The Woodvilles, okay, they were unpopular, but they were nevertheless the king's uncle, and they had been firm and staunch supporters of the Yorkist regime throughout the 1470s. Richard's claim to the throne was also clearly spurious. Few people could have believed that any pre-contract to Eleanor Butler, if it in fact had ever existed, would have disbarred Edward's children with Elizabeth Woodville from actually succeeding to the throne. The circumstances of his taking the throne, a proclamation by the Duke of Buckingham, were not really sufficient grounds, I think. But most important of all were the rumours that were widespread by the autumn of 1483 that Richard had in fact murdered his nephews. In the 15th century, like today, the murder of children was unacceptable. To murder one's nephews, particularly if they were the sons of kings, was simply a step too far for the political nation to stomach. Richard's actions in the aftermath of Buckingham's rebellion and in the latter year of his reign really undermine the lack of support that he had. Richard was forced to rely on an ever smaller group of supporters, and in doing so he undermined the real fabric of late medieval society. Richard's northern supporters were planted into various parts of the realm to fill the gap left by those people who had been implicated in Buckingham's rebellion. Sir Richard Ratcliffe, for example, the Yorkshireman, was put in positions of authority and given lands in Devon. In Kent, Sir Robert Brackenbury, another Yorkshireman, was given lands and made sheriff. This plantation of outsiders really upset the local order and alienated people who should have supported Richard as king. When Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven on the 7th of August 1485, the lack of support that Richard enjoyed as king became all too obvious. Henry Tudor had little support too. It was not as if on his landing in England crowds of well-wishers flocked to his banner, far from it. At Bosworth, Henry was actually only accompanied by two members of the English nobility, the Earl of Oxford and his uncle Jasper, soon to be restored as Earl of Pembroke. But very few members of the English aristocracy also turned out for Richard. At the battlefield, he was actually only accompanied by the Duke of Norfolk, by Francis Viscount Lovell, and by Walter Lord Ferrers. Other noblemen were present. The Earl of Northumberland, of course, was there, ostensibly as Richard's supporter, but took no part in the battle. And the Stanley family, the Earl of Derby, of course, played a crucial role in the battle, but not as Richard's supporters. But in the last instance, they decided to throw their weight behind Tudor. And Stanley's intervention at this crucial part of the battle was probably instrumental in winning the day for Henry Tudor. Just as important as the nobility were the gentry. Many of those who were summoned to attend the battle by Richard or by his noble supporters actually ignored this summons. A good example of this is the East Anglian man Sir John Paston. Paston had received a personal summons from his lord, the Duke of Norfolk, to attend him on the battlefield at Bosworth, but Paston delayed, prevaricated. He sort of set off from home but didn't hasten to the battle, and by not being at the battle, obviously protected himself from any future recriminations from the new king, Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor then became Henry VII in 1485, not because of the wide support that he enjoyed among the political nation, but because of Richard's failure to engender that support himself. Richard's lack of support, I think, can be summed up in two key factors. The first of these was his narrow territorial base as Duke of Gloucester. As the leading nobleman in the north of England in the 1470s, he was a key component of Edward IV's regional policy of farming out the king's government to areas of the realm to noblemen that he could trust. But the problem was Richard was just that. He was a nobleman. He was a magnate who should have served effectively under another king. This territorial power, this loyalty that he commanded in the north as a regional magnate, could not easily be transplanted to the kind of loyalty and the kind of support, the broad basis of support that he needed as king. The second, and I think most fundamental reason for Richard's failure to gain support were the circumstances of his usurpation. His claim to the throne was flimsy. The accusations that he levelled at Edward IV and his sons were even more so. His choice of the Duke of Buckingham as his leading supporter was ill-advised. And in the final analysis, the rumours that Richard had killed his nephews proved fatal. Richard did not prove himself a bad king in the day-to-day government of the realm, but his reign lacked legitimacy. The circumstances of his accession to the throne really compromised his kingship and his ability to engender support. Crucially, that support simply didn't materialise when Richard needed it most, and it was for this reason that he lost his crown to Henry Tudor on the battlefield of Bosworth on the 22nd of August, 1485.